more of these kinds of interdisciplinary discussions. This is a whole movement too, this whole interdisciplinary, bringing scientists together from different fields and seeing what comes out of it. But a scientist who can't explain what they're doing clearly is a scientist who doesn't really quite know what they're doing. So I think and I know that this is true as a writer too, that until I can write it, I haven't really figured it out. And that's what makes writing so hard, is because as you're writing, you're figuring it out. It's like basically it's a problem-solving exercise. And it's the same with explaining your science, the problem-solving exercise.
As a follow-up to that, so I feel like you're saying that scientists should be able to bring it down to the public's level. So do you think it's like unreasonable to have the hope or expectation that we can bring the public up to the scientist's level?
Well, what do you mean by the scientist level? Because if you're again talking about a more of a generalist understanding, yes, I think that to me the biggest gap in getting people to be able to understand science, there are certain things that have come up, like having a much better knowledge of statistics. This is really, and probabilities, even very simple things, like I talked about in the canon, getting people to do these exercises like flipping a coin 100 times and writing out whether it's heads or tails, and you start to see these patterns that show up, where you have 5, 6, 7 heads or tails in a row, and until you actually kind of do that experiment, you tend to think of randomness as being much more random than it really is, back and forth. And that when people start to even get just that very basic understanding of probabilities, I think that it starts to make their thinking, their critical thinking skills, all of a sudden come into play, where you're not just prone to superstitious thinking, where you're actually not seeing patterns everywhere as having only a meaning. That's one of the foundations. And but the other one that I think is important is just feeling the self-confidence to understand the science. Jackie Barton, who's a chemist at Caltech, and she just talked about this quite a bit, that people say to her when they find out she's a chemist, "Oh, I flunked high school chemistry." Every single person in America flunked high school chemistry. And it's unbelievable how many, and then they immediately, on saying that, that's like their ticket to never have to listen to another word she says. And she gets a little annoyed at that, because they're almost proud of their ignorance, and they're sticking by, "I stand by my ignorance." And she says people don't have that feeling about, if you were to be politically ignorant about the situation in Iraq, and a lot of people are, but you wouldn't brag about it. So she actually thinks that people should be, that shame should be more of a motivator to get people to spend a little more time to say, maybe I actually should try to understand these issues. Like, maybe I should try to understand what it means when we talk about DNA or a cell or whatever it happens to be. And she thinks that people can do it and should do it, and that there should be more of an expectation that they're going to do it. But by the same token, I actually think that there's a more general anti-intellectualism that interferes with this, that we focus on scientific ignorance, but there's actually a lot of ignorance generally. I mean, I mentioned Iraq as an example. I mean, there's a lot of ignorance about history, about where nations are located, all sorts of things that we should all be a lot more ashamed about than we are. So, but science, I think people, if they feel like they can, if they feel entitled, and if they make just reasonably concerted effort, they can actually get brought up quite a bit. As a science writer, I try to do my bit, but there's a lot to be done. People are also busy, and they have their own lives, and you understand that. So do the best you can, soldier on. Be calm, yeah. Well, actually, that's one of the things I've often said I like about scientists. They tend to be pretty rational people. They don't get too excited and about, it's like hysterical. And that's actually a nice mindset to be around. It's like, oh, the world's not going to end tomorrow. And that's the kind of thinking I'd like to see brought to bear in other areas of life. That's why I encourage scientists to become more active in the community. They're reasonable, mostly reasonable. Look at the evidence, okay, we can do a cost benefit or a risk analysis, and instead of just saying, oh, there's too much mercury in the tuna, it's like, well, how much tuna can I eat without having to worry? You can start to actually do your own cost benefit analysis. You can look at all sorts of problems with this mindset, and all of a sudden you don't feel so scared, you don't feel so helpless. So these are also basic skills that I think could be useful to people, just to do the experiment where you can, to weigh the evidence, and to not be so afraid and intimidated.
One last question?
Yeah. So my question, I think, relates to what you were just talking about, because you talked a little bit about probability and also about ignorance. And I think that the public often views science as sort of like some collection of facts. And a lot of the science writing, I mean, good science writing is not like this, but a lot of the science writing that you read is like, this locus is associated with such and such disease. It seems like reporting facts that scientists have found. And my entire primary education was teaching me facts of science, like, that the Earth goes around the sun, which to me, I don't really mind being ignorant of. I don't really know how that matters or why I should actually care about that at all. It just seems silly to me that that was what my education was about. To me, science is about evidence. And to understand that, you have to understand the basic probability and statistics, that basic literacy that you were talking about earlier. And how is it first of all, do you agree? And secondly, if you do, how, as a science journalist, do you incorporate this focus on evidence rather than fact while speaking to a population that doesn't know what a p-value is? I mean, to me, it seems like every Tuesday the Science Times should just be the basic thing, science literacy, so that people could learn those things before they can actually go learn a bunch of facts that aren't really important. They should just learn how to evaluate evidence and think statistically.
Well, you try to do that by describing the experiments that were done. If you talk about how the research was done and what they found, that's a good part of talking about evidence-based as opposed to just stating the fact, okay? And it's especially good if you have room to actually go through several sort of stages of that. I mean, we're talking about alternative hypotheses and interpretations. But there is also a limit to how much you can do in any one article. There's a limit in space. And what you try to do is you try to get people interested in this particular subject. I mean, that's what I feel like my greatest obligation is, to get them interested enough to go further with it. Because right there in the limited amount of space, you can only accomplish so much. But in terms of the body of facts thing, let me tell you that is the #1 complaint that I get as scientists. What do they wish the public understood about science? One, that science is not a body of facts. That is #1. #2 is learn more, that they wish they had some basic understanding of statistics and probabilities. So those are the two big things that come up from every scientist in every field. And I agree, the body of facts things is very important. But at the same time, when you're writing a story, to talk in generalities is kind of, that's it. You've lost your audience. So you have to give examples, and you have to talk about specifics, and you have to talk about things as though there is some basis in fact, and it isn't all just up in the air. So you can only go so far in saying science is not a body of facts. No, but it is an understanding that has particular details in it, and those details are always what bring things alive to people, that the abstraction is what kind of puts them off, and it's the details that engage them. It's like knowing the personality of a friend or something. So as a writer, that is your obligation, is to engage the reader, and not just be didactic. So sometimes, yes, you do have to talk about particulars. There's no way around it if you're going to write a decent story. And so there, as a writer, you struggle with this too. Any one story can only accomplish so much, and you just hope that if the person really likes the subject. I have to say, one of my proudest things was I wrote a story, this was a while ago, but about orchids, and a friend of my brother's who was she was in sound editing or something. She read the story and she says, "This is what I want to do with my life." And she went back to school and got her PhD and is now a botanist. And so I like to think every so often what you want to do is say, "Oh, this is interesting. I think I'll look in more." And that's why, there are now all these links scattered throughout, so you can look into it yourself. And that's what you hope to do, is to get people turned on to the subject that they might otherwise have had no interest in at all. And if you do that in a responsible way, that's, in the end, probably the best you can do. And I can tell you the space is getting tighter and tighter, and everything is being squeezed. So.
Yeah, I don't mean to, I love science journalism. I think that the problem really lies with science education.
Yes,
yeah.
Well, I agree with that too. And there's another area that we need a lot of improvement, really need a lot of improvement. But that also takes money, and then there's how to fund it, and so it quickly gets into these enormous problems on a society-wide basis that you think, there are a lot of people working on this. I can tell you this again because I hear it from people who are back there in the White House who would really care about good science education, but every single little thing they try to do becomes politicized. Everything, every single thing. And how do we get past that? What are we going to do about this terrible problem of partisanship that is really completely crippling our country and stopping progress when there can be a lot more done? But every single thing now is seen as a political act, even in science, and it's really too bad. I do think that is something that we need to address as a nation somehow. And that's why, again, I think we've got to get more scientists in there, doing the politics, just getting to Washington and moving this ship forward.
Well, I think we're just,
Yeah.
I just wanted to close by commenting that we are sitting here in a perfect storm caused by the tools and results of science, the values, the bipartisan politics that we're sort of in the middle of. The human genome has been sequenced. If you caught the New York Times on Sunday, the Obama administration is looking at the possibility of creating a huge project to map the active human brain, just like the Human Genome Project was started in the 1990s. So these are no longer issues just for discussion. So I wanted to close by saying, for those of us who are scientists in the room, it is time to bring our very clearest lens to how we ask and answer questions, and to fully understand what our data are telling us. For the academics in the room, which is the rest of us, it is time to teach and learn scientific literacy and critical thinking. It's time to learn how to be responsible about the knowledge that science brings us. And I'd like to thank Natalie Anger, who's been a primary crusader in this effort. And I hope that our conversation together has brought this campus forward in this endeavor. So thank you very, very
Yes, on behalf of the PSU, we'd like to thank the New York Times, Ms. Anger, and Professor Levin. We hope this continues more dialogue about these issues. And this is recorded, so you can see this online and share it with your friends as well. So let's join in another round of applause for our wonderful